Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're asking, what role should care play in how we think about punishment? Hello, my name is Alan Renwick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Care ethics is a branch of moral philosophy that focuses on how we relate to, respond to, and care for each other. Its central question is not about what abstract principles of justice we should follow, but rather about how we should respond to the needs of a given person in a particular set of circumstances. It's been around for several decades, but now one of our colleagues here at UCL has applied it to a setting that we might not think its natural home, the world of punishment. Dr. Helen Brown Coverdale, who is lecturer teaching in political theory in the Department of Political Science at UCL, argues that looking at our practices of punishment through the lens of care gives us a new and valuable perspective on them. So what would it mean to approach punishment through an ethic of care? And what counterarguments might there be to taking such an approach? Well, I'm very happy to say that Dr. Helen Brown Coverdale joins me here to discuss. Helen, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics. And can we start by exploring care ethics a bit? I attempted a very quick introduction there, but how would you describe it? And what motivates those who have developed it?
Thanks. It's nice to be here, Alan. So, I think you've given a nice introduction to care ethics there. I think it's starting to think about people's needs and separating it from the way in which we normally think about moral reasoning. So, care ethics is a slightly different mode of doing moral reasoning. So, traditionally, from a classical liberal paradigm, we begin from individuals and we work outwards. So, we think about the individual, we think about their rights, we think about duties this implies that other people have towards us, and about what they're owed. And we think about individuals as being isolated and independent and self-sufficient. And the care ethics perspective kind of says, well, human beings aren't really like that. So if you're starting from a model of understanding moral reasoning that kind of has human beings wrong, then it's going to end up a little bit confused. So we start by looking at the relationships. The thing about human beings is that everybody is in relationships. Some we choose, some we don't. So nobody chooses their family, but we all choose our friends. But these relationships come with responsibilities to help meet the needs of people around us. So we're all in these networks of relationships with responsibilities attached to them. We're less concerned about who those individuals are. We come along, we flesh those blank spaces out, if you like, later on. But everybody is uniquely situated. So the nice thing about care ethics is that it's relational. It acknowledges that relationships are normal, valuable parts of human lives. They're intrinsically valuable to us and they're instrumentally valuable to us because we can't meet our own needs without them. We are interdependent on one another. Everybody is dependent at some stage in their lives. If we're very lucky, it's when we're very small infants and when we're very elderly people, if we get lucky enough to live that long. But anybody can become vulnerable at any point during their life and be dependent on someone else. And care ethics wants to say, well, that's entirely normal. It's entirely normal that we have limits on the kinds of things that we can do. And we need help from other people to meet our needs. So figuring out exactly what kinds of things we might need and what those responsibilities might entail is situated. So we think very much about the practice of caring as well. So this is a praxis. This is the point where theory and practice sort of smooshes up into each other, which is where policy gets really important. There's no single exemplar of care ethics, but classic examples are things like healthcare and care for children. And this is based around activities that meet basic needs, that build capabilities, such as enhancing your skills or alleviating unwanted pain. So if you're doing any of those things, you're probably doing caring. But in order to do caring well, you've got to be responsive and respectful and attentive to the person you're caring for. So you need to be aware of the needs around you and thinking about how you might use the resources you have to meet them. But you also need to be working with that person in solidarity, thinking about what their preferences are about how their needs are met, and how you can adapt and change that care to make it better for that person and as the situation changes. So again, we expect change over time. We expect people to grow and develop over their lives. So there's this kind of narrative element to care as well as this sort of situatedness, which I find really helpful.
And would I be right in thinking that care ethics has its roots in feminist theories?
Yes, certainly the part of care ethics I work with is definitely feminist informed. This comes from Carol Gilligan's work in the 80s. And she looked at some work on moral reasoning, which empirical studies had been done on young boys and men, and suggested that maybe women were reasoning differently, because the original research seemed to show that women and girls did not reason in the same advanced capacities as men and boys did. So the original experiment was called the Heinz experiment, which is quite a nice little story. So once upon a time in Europe, there was a man called Heinz, and his wife was very sick. And it so happened that a chemist who lived in the same small village as them had developed a drug that would cure her. And so Heinz goes to the chemist and says, "Please, will you sell me the drug?" And the chemist names his price. And of course, he's got a complete monopoly over this. So that gives a hugely exploitative price that Heinz can't possibly afford. And Heinz goes away kind of depressed and thinks, well, what should I do? And there are two ways of approaching this problem. On the one hand, you might say, well, the chemist is clearly doing something wrong because we should be respecting people's right to life, and we can apply kind of that sort of rights framework. Or you might say, well, in that case, Heinz might be completely justified in stealing the drug. Or you might say, well, it's the druggist's property, and we need to respect the norms of property, and therefore Heinz shouldn't steal the drug. But there are other ways of reasoning through this, thinking more relationally. So Heinz has this responsibility to his wife, and possibly his wife has this connection with the community already. And the chemist himself is part of this community as well. So instead of resorting to stealing the drug, maybe there are other things we could do. So the girl who's asked in these studies says, well, maybe Heinz could hold a bake sale, right, and raise the money. Or maybe he could find a way of getting to being allowed to pay in installments, right? So there are other ways of trying to negotiate this kind of complexity and negotiate the resources we have and the needs that we have and trying to fit them together, rather than just applying a set of rules and following the rules. So it's often said about care ethics, because it's so very abstract, because it leaves space to zoom into the particular. It's often said that it resists rules, and I think a better way of thinking about that is just that it's leaving that space to come into the particular. So one of the nice things is it can help us to choose between competing sets of principles when we're not sure which one to apply.
Interesting. So this is exactly what I was intrigued by here, because I can completely understand how an ethic of care makes sense in our kind of personal relations and how we deal with individuals. But when we move from the realm of sort of individual moral philosophy to the realm of political philosophy, then we're thinking about, how states should act towards their citizens. And we tend to think it's really important that states act towards all of their citizens in the same way. There's equality, and that kind of implies rules, and we have kind of standard principles that we operate. How does care ethics think about that?
Okay, so I think there are a few things to say here. So firstly, decisions about who gets cared for, which needs are met, who does that labour, are all social and political decisions as much as they are also personal decisions. And the skills that we use in caring, that kind of working in solidarity with someone, hearing their needs, listening to their preferences, working with them around that, even when we're not necessarily in their position, we can empathise with them and understand their position. These are all the skills that we need to work as citizens in a democratic community, and to engage with one another in debate, and to hear views that we don't necessarily share, but to figure out ways of living together around that. So these are skills that we need as democratic citizens, which is something that Joan Tronto points out. And I think it's also fair to say that a private individual's relationships with other people is something that you can choose to sever, right? So care is a perspective that wants to say relationships are really valuable, but we don't want to fetishize them. It may be the case that if you're in an abusive relationship, the best thing to do for you is to end that relationship. And nobody is obliged to be in a relationship with the abuser, even if the abuser still needs care, right? So if you think about just the people you choose to be friends with, and once upon a time when we could go and hang out and have coffee, there'll be some people you would choose to do that with and some people you wouldn't, and that's absolutely fine. But you're right, there is something special about the relationship between the state and the individual, and the state can't turn its back on the citizen. It can't turn its back on individuals in the society. It has responsibilities towards us, particularly if that person is someone who other people are not able to care for, not available to care for. So maybe someone who doesn't have many family members, or any who are close by, or perhaps someone who has been abusive, right? So if a relationship has been severed because you're abusive, nobody else is obliged to have a relationship with you, but the state still needs to be there to step in to provide that care if necessary. This is why we have things like welfare safety nets.
So you think that we should apply the care ethics approach to the world of punishment in particular? That's the kind of core idea that we're exploring here. What's motivated you to make that connection?
I just want to be clear that I'm absolutely not saying that punishment is care or that everything we do in punishment is caring. But what I do want to say is there are some really big overlaps between some of the things that we find in punishment practices and the practices of caring. And if we were to use the approach and the methods and the standards of care to try to improve those practices, I think they would be better as practices of punishment as well. But the trouble is we don't recognise that because, as you've pointed out, when you think about punishment, the first thing you think of is definitely not care. But to an extent, care can't be avoided because these are people we're talking about. So if you're punishing a person, that person is going to need care. They're going to have needs that are going to need to be met. But also, if you look at the practices within even the paradigmatic penal arrangements like prison, you will still find care in there. So one of my favourite examples of care in a prison is the role of the personal officer. So back in the 80s, there were some riots at HMP Strangeways, and following the Wolf Report into those riots, every prisoner has had a personal officer since. So this is supposed to be a named point of contact between the prison system and the people who are held inside the prison. And the personal officer is supposed to help with anything from dietary requirements to sentence planning to arranging bereavement counselling. And this is a description I take from a House of Commons report into the role of the prison officer. But if you look at those activities, dietary requirements, sentence planning, which might include education, capability building, and bereavement counselling, these are exactly the practices of care. This is meeting needs, this is building capabilities, and this is avoiding unwanted pain, unnecessary pain. But that's only one example of care in a prison. There are a lot of other examples. So if you think about people who provide education in prisons, chaplaincy staff, healthcare staff, substance misuse treatments, all these are forms of care, but one of my favourite examples is peer-to-peer care between prisoners. So there are prison listeners are run by the Samaritans. They use exactly the same sort of training that they use for people who run the helpline in the community. So the Samaritans provide a suicide support helpline. And there are prison listeners available to listen to prisoners in distress 24/7 every day of the year, and the prisoners who run the listening service will arrange that within the prison, so there's always someone available, usually in confidence. So that's just one way in which you can see that this helps the prison service to meet its own targets of helping people to avoid being in desperate situations and helping to protect the lives of the people in the prison.
It's very interesting listening to you there talking about this. You know, we sometimes think of political theorists as these people who do very abstract thinking in their ivory towers, whereas you're talking about the real everyday practical realities of people who are within the penal system. And I think listeners are often quite interested in where academics get their ideas from. And I mean, in your case, you've worked in this system directly, haven't you? You haven't just been in the ivory tower all the time. You actually have experience of working within the penal system.
Yeah, I worked in the criminal justice voluntary sector for about 2 years on a helpline giving information and advice about pretty much anything you could describe as a resettlement issue. But as well as doing advice by phone and by letter, we also used to go into prisons occasionally to give advice. And one of the things I learnt by doing this was I could see all of the damage that various different types of punishments do to people's lives. I've got a friend who's a criminologist who introduces the concept to his first year undergraduates by saying, punishment is when the state says, right, you did something wrong and now we're going to crush you. But punishment disrupts people's lives. It inhibits their ability to meet their own needs and to take care of themselves and to look after their families. It can make ordinary everyday things very, very difficult. So it's really hard to get buildings insurance, for instance, or it can be hard to find a job or hard to find somewhere to live, depending on the type of conviction you have. And I could see all of this damage happening, but at the same time, after someone's sentence, there is a range of public and private and philanthropic attempts to try and help people put their lives back together. And these also happen within practices of punishment as well. So if you think about some of the things a probation officer will be doing is trying to help people to find a job. And some of the things that will go on in a prison is trying to help people address problems that they might have which are exacerbating their needs. So if you think about looking for mental health support and addiction support services, there are shockingly high numbers of people in prison with at least 2 mental health problems. So I could see all of this. We're using all of this public money to lock people up, which is really expensive. And while we're doing it, at the very same time, we're trying to mitigate the damage that we're causing. And then we spend more money afterwards trying to help people to get back on their feet so that they can look after themselves and their families again. And it just didn't seem to make any sense at all to me, which is one of the reasons why I work on that now. Much as I love political theory and I'm definitely a normative person at heart, I don't think I can do my job at all unless I have access to the work of my social science colleagues as well. So I draw on a lot of criminology in my work.
And are there particular implications, kind of policy implications, I guess, of your work in terms of how we should change the way in which we run our prison system, given the care ethics perspective?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of ways of looking at this. So on the one hand, we might want to say that what's going on is sort of a contingent problem, right? So I want to say that there's a relationship between the way we think about punishment in theory and the way in which it gets practiced. And maybe it's just a problem that theorists haven't explored this sort of more practical caring area yet. It's just been an oversight, in which case maybe this is just we need to do a little bit more theory, and that's not a big problem. There's a slightly more radical implication that maybe this is a structural problem. Maybe the way in which we frame what punishment is when we think about it just makes it really, really difficult to think about care at all. And I don't actually take a position on that in the paper that we're discussing today, but I think it's probably a structural issue, and this is something I want to write more about the way in which we conceptualise what punishment is.
And what would you say to those? So you were talking earlier about how you saw that punishment was causing real difficulties in people's lives. What would you say to those who say, well, that's kind of the point of punishment? You're trying to make things difficult in people's lives because you're trying to punish, and that's part of being punished. How would you respond to that? Okay,
so that's a really important point. Absolutely, when someone is being punished for a crime that they've been found guilty of following due process, we might make mistakes. We're just human beings here, but we have to take what we've done as the best possible application of due process. Then yes, people do need to be punished. But there's a difference between sending someone to prison to deprive them of their liberty for a set period of time. So that just means that they're not allowed to go where they would like to go and do what they would like to do. But there's a whole range of other problems that come with that. There's the disruption this causes to people's relationships, particularly with their children, and the sort of collateral consequences of punishment as well. So I've discussed a little bit around that, sort of applying for jobs and the difficulties that you'll have there in those areas later on. And all of this kind of additional damage is not really what we intend. Prisons are stressful and violent and threatening places at the best of times. And I expect during a pandemic lockdown, they're going to be even more stressful and violent places where people are currently feeling very, very desperate because they're locked in their cells for a lot longer periods at the moment, particularly if there is staff shortages because staff are sick. So yes, absolutely, people need to be punished. But there are ways in which we can think about how we punish people and maybe slightly change what we are doing so that it is less additionally harmful in ways that it doesn't need to be. So you were suggesting that maybe there might be some slight differences in how we use prison. So we might think about who we are sending to prison. And at the moment, we use prison for a huge range of offences, which I think is probably far too broad. So it doesn't necessarily seem to make sense to send people to prison for minor property offences, for instance.
So why does that not make sense? And what does care ethics tell us that is driving that answer to that?
Okay, so I think what you're getting at here is this idea of proportionality. So we might think there's a couple of things that come along with proportionality. So on the one hand, we want to say that people who commit more serious crimes should get more serious types of punishment. And on the other hand, we want to say people who commit the same sort of crime should get the same sort of punishment, right? And if we want to take account of that similarity, I think we need to rethink how we do proportionality. So this is getting really situated in particular, which is where I think care ethics comes in. We're really good at the moment at looking at each criminal offence and treating the offence as a unique instance. This is why the sentencer will look at the sentencing guidelines and see how they apply in this case, and they will look at all the facts of the case and determine exactly how serious this particular instance is. But we do less good at looking at two different offenders and saying, how are these two different people in completely different situations actually similar or not? So if you want to make sure that we are punishing like for like, if that makes sense, or punishing people who've committed the same type of offence in the same sort of a way, then I think we need to take more account of the similarities and differences between offenders as well as between offences. So rethinking proportionality is something I'm working on at the moment, and I'm taking out a paper on that to the Oxford University Jurisprudence Discussion Group in March. So I can come back and answer that question, but I haven't written the paper.
That's really interesting, and it sounds like it's getting towards an answer to the next question that I was going to ask, which was basically how do the kind of implications of care ethics in this realm differ from those of traditional liberal theory? Because it sounds, as I'm listening to you, as though the traditional principles around proportionality, around respect for individuals' rights, those kinds of principles that liberal theory would tend to come up with sound quite similar to the sorts of things that you're coming up with as well.
So that's an interesting point. There's two different ways of looking at care ethics, the feminist version of care ethics. And on the one hand, there's a bunch of scholars who want to say that actually it's very similar to liberalism, and we can just revise this a little, and one will collapse into the other and everything's good. And then there's a school of thought where scholars want to say, well, actually, these are two completely different things, and liberalism can't be saved. We need to throw it out and start over. And I'm somewhere in the middle. I want to say they are very often compatible. It's just that we take a slightly different perspective on the same thing. So if you imagine looking at a building and then going up a hill and looking at the same building, it's going to look a bit different. So I think that what care ethics does well is it starts off with this relational thinking. It brings this approach where we can see the relationships between one another and figure out, well, how do we meet the needs that we have between us in the context of all of the other needs that are going on in society and the resources that we have around us? And how do we do that to best effect? And so I often end up talking in terms of things like efficiency, which is definitely a strange thing for a care ethics ethicist to talk about. But this is definitely something that we do want. A good use of our resources is an efficient use of our resources that's going to meet as many needs as possible. But I think it's definitely fair enough to say that I think care ethics is able to look at the individual and respect individual rights in the way that not all care ethicists might. And certainly in the ways that it's been criticised as not being suitable. But what liberalism is less good at seeing as respecting the individual and respecting the individual's dignity. But unless you can recognise that relational connection, and that my dignity is to an extent bound up with yours, in that we both have these needs and we're interdependent on one another, and that we should expect to have our own different, unique limitations in our lives and to require help from others. Because we have that slightly more relational approach, it brings a little something else to think about. Well, how do we do this together? How do we use our resources together? Which I think is particularly useful for looking at problems where we're talking about a social problem or a political sort of scale.
And can you just flesh out whose relationship with whom are we talking about there? So on one side, there's the person who's being punished. Who's on the other side of that relationship?
That's a really good question. So I'm not just thinking about one relationship. I'm thinking about, it often gets termed as a web of relationships. Fabric and thread and weaving metaphors are all over care ethics, but it's the person who's being punished for their offence. It's their social situation. So what are their family responsibilities like? Do they have caring responsibilities for children or for elderly parents? It's their relationship with the person that they've offended against. And ideally, it would be great if the offender was sorry. It would be great if the offender could do something to help repair the damage. But you can't force that because it must be left up to the victim of crime to say, you know what, this person has done enough and I really don't want them to be involved with me any further. Thank you very much. Although what I want to say is that what we owe victims is very separate to how the state responds to offenders in punishment. So you've got that state relationship with the offending person as well. But you've also got the relationships within the wider community. So what's the impact on extended families and people who are friends who might be affected by association? What's the impact on the employer whose member of staff can no longer turn up for work on Monday because they're now serving a prison sentence? So there's a range of relationships there that I think are important, and exactly which one is going to be most important is going to depend on the particular situation. And this is where care ethics leaves us a little bit more room to zoom in and see what those particular details are on the ground. But that can then inform what it is that we need to do. So what does it mean to treat someone as an equal? What does it mean to respect them? That might vary according to the context that we find them in. And having that extra information on which to base those decisions, I think, is generally a helpful thing. We usually want to say that decisions which are based on more information rather than less, and with more deliberation rather than less, are better decisions.
Very interesting. Final question. You're seeking to shift how we think about the world of punishment here. And it sounds like there's a really important ongoing research agenda. You've begun to hint a little bit at some of the further things that are on that agenda. And where are you going next in your thinking? What are the big questions that you want to explore?
So I want to have a think about the tools that are implicit to care ethics that I can see, having spent well over 10 years thinking about this, that help us to think through these relationships and which ones matter and which particular facets of context do we need to attend to, and then applying that to inform better what it means to fill out those duties that we would have on a sort of traditional liberal rights and duties framework. And I think that can be really useful in a policy setting, in a social setting. And so I'm hoping to write something longer about how we might use these kind of internal tools, which almost presuppose that we're continually having some kind of oversight and checks and balances. And if you're not kind of looking out for other people and sort of providing oversight to their caring as well, you're sort of doing something wrong. So it's almost implicit within this that there is this kind of oversight and scrutiny, which will hopefully help us to produce better outcomes. And I think that has a really wide range of applications. Something I'm particularly interested in moving to, although I still think I have a lot to say about punishment, is that I think care ethics is a really useful way of thinking about doing moral reasoning when we have connected entities that are interacting. And I think this is going to be really useful for thinking about data ethics and about the ethics of technology more broadly, particularly as this becomes more embedded in our lives and in our politics. Maurice Hamilton has noted there are some synergies between care ethics and design thinking in the context of business ethics. And I think he's exactly right. But design thinking, which is a user-centric approach to design, is a concept that gets borrowed from engineering by business studies. And I'm interested in the ways in which regulation and ethics are going to need to work together across a range of different relationships if we're going to have the kind of ethical data practice that citizens can trust. So I'm also hoping that might make ethics more accessible to scientists and engineers as well.
Wow, fascinating. Well, we will have to have you back on to UCL Uncovering Politics once you've had the chance to explore that a bit. But you've already given us a really great introduction to care ethics for those who didn't already know about it, and also exploration of its application to the world of punishment. So thank you so much, Helen, for being part of UCL Uncovering Politics today. And if you'd like to read more, the article that we've been discussing is freely available for all online. It's by Dr. Helen Brown Coverdale, and it's called Caring and the Prison in Philosophy, Policy and Practice under Lock and Key, published in the Journal of Applied Philosophy. And we'll be sure to put those details in the show notes for this episode. Next week, we're going to be looking at the politics of immigration and asylum. We'll be asking why it is that some countries respond much more favourably to migrants and asylum seekers than others. Remember to make sure you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Renwick. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.